Good morning everyone. Welcome back to my channel, and please subscribe to my channel and let the learning reach us to each and every corner. Okay, let us start the lecture and let us start the discussion. Let us start our learning journey of learnings. Right? Let us start with unit number 1, diversity in living world. These all learnings belongs to the CBSE 11th standard, and I'm going to make you understand and learn about these concepts according to the NEET syllabus. Okay, let us start with the learnings. Diversity, the name itself will tell you a lot of things. Like, diversity is the presence of lot of different kinds of species, isn't it? Right? We will see a lot of different kinds of species in our day-to-day life. Now, in this chapter, we are going to learn about them. We are going to know about them and how they got their names and how they are living, how they reproduce, and all these things we are going to learn in this unit. Okay, let us start the learning and let us go forward with the chapter number 1, the living world. Right? Let us move with the introduction of the living world. And before that, living world, what actually the living world is? Why we are calling this as a living world? Why we are not considering as a non-living world? Because living organisms perform lot of activities, lot of biological activities, lot of physical activities, lot of chemical changes they will undergo. That's why we are going to study, or we are going to learn about the living world in this chapter. Okay, let us start with the introduction. Let's start with the introduction. The living organism interact with one another as well as with their physical chemical environment. Right? Yes. The living organisms interact with one another. Right? We have seen that the living organisms, in the sense when we talk about the birds, they will interact with each other with having different kinds of sounds, and they will fly in a group from one place to another place. Right? They are interacting with each other. Right? Whenever they found a food particle, like for example in the crows, they will call the other companion, other colleague of itself to join the feast. Right? And this is what we are saying about interacting with each other. But whenever they found water, they all collectively drink the water. Right? In this biological world, all are interacting with each other. Right? All are interdependent on each other. We are dependent on the plants for our food. Plants depend on the minerals which are present in the soil and the sunlight and the water. Right? Like that, all are interconnected. Let us learn the next thing. The living organisms occur almost in every habitat on earth. The living organisms are present in every corner on this earth. Maybe it's a hot climatic condition, maybe it's a cold climatic conditions like in the polar regions, or in very hot in the desert areas and in the deciduous forests, and a lot of habitats in the deep sea and deep oceans and marine animals. A lot of habitats are there for these living organisms. We will find a lot of living organisms in all the habitats on this earth. Then, all living beings share certain unified and basic characteristics. See, when we talk about a living organism, they will possess a specific characteristics to be called as living organisms. Right? To be called as a living organisms, there are certain defining characteristics which are to be possessed by living organisms. Right? Then let us learn about them. These include organization, cell organization, energy utilization, regulation or homeostasis, growth and development, reproduction and adaptation. Okay, let us learn all these characteristics one by one. Okay, these are all the major characteristics of living organisms like growth, reproduction, metabolism, cellular organization, consciousness and body organization. Right? Let us learn all these characteristics and let us understand what actually the growth is and how is it involved in the living organism to make it a living organism, whether the growth is a defining characteristic of a living organism or not. Okay, let us start with the growth. Next slide. Growth. What actually the growth is? We talk about growth. Like in the previous semester, I got A grade, and in the present semester, and I got A plus. This is the growth. Growth in the number, right? Percentage is equal to the growth, is equal to the grade. Like the same way, what is that involved in our body? Like it is increase in the mass, right? Growth is nothing but increase in the mass, increase in the number, right? Maybe it is internal growth or an external growth, right? There are two things will be involved. Maybe it's a internal growth or maybe an external growth. Let us consider this growth in the living organisms. In the living organisms, it will be the increase in the mass internally. Internal mass will grow internally by the cell division. By the cell division, the living organisms will grow. Right? And when there is an accumulation of mass and external particles on the mountains. Mountain is a non-living organism, non-living thing. When it accumulates all the sand particles and the soil particles and everything, it also shows the growth. But it is not like it is growing internally, it is growing externally. The living organisms will grow internally, it will show the growth, increase in the size. They will show increase in the size, increase in the mass. Right? When it comes to the living organisms, they will grow continuously. The plants will grow until their completion of their lifespan, until they die. But other living organisms like human beings, cats and dogs, at a certain age and at a certain point of their lifespan, they will stop the growth. But the cell division will be there to replace the damaged or dead cells. But we will stop the growth at certain height, reaching a certain height. Then let us see, is it a growth is a defining characteristic or a non-defining characteristic? Like non-living thing, a mountain is also growing, and a living thing, human being, is also growing. A plant is also growing. Then it is growing internally, the living organisms are growing internally, and the non-living things are growing externally. Then as per the definition of the growth, growth is increase in the size, increase in the mass or increase in the number. They are also increasing in the mass, and the living organisms also increasing in the mass, then we will conclude that, we will consider that growth is not a defining characteristic of a living organism. We should not consider that whatever the thing which is growing is a living organism. Then growth is not a perfect characteristic of a living organism. Should not be a defining characteristic of a living organism. Right? Then let us move to the next, reproduction. What actually the reproduction is? Production of offsprings by the combination of two different sexes or by a single parent. Right? That is called a reproduction. Then we will take it, the reproduction, shall we consider reproduction as a defining characteristic of a living organism? Let us understand all these steps. Let us see how the living organisms reproduce, and what about the non-living organisms. Right? And when we consider that reproduction is the production of offsprings or the progeny, all the living organisms will perform reproduction. Right? And when we say that all the living organisms will perform reproduction, then we have to consider the species which are sterile, which can't reproduce, but they are living. They are performing all the other metabolic activities and all other functions in their body, but they are not performing a reproduction, that is production of offsprings. Then whether they are not belongs to the living organisms? No, they are also belongs to the living organisms, but they can't reproduce. Then what about the female bees, the honeybees? The female bees, they can't reproduce, they can't produce the eggs, but they are performing most of the characteristics of a living organism. And what about the mule, which is formed by the combination of horse and the donkey? That is also a sterile organism. It can't produce the babies, it can't reproduce its babies, right, due to chromosomal imbalance during their formation. Right? Then we will consider that reproduction is also not a defining characteristic of a living organism. Right? Then let us move on to the next characteristic, metabolism. What is the metabolism? What actually the metabolism is? Metabolism involves catabolism and the anabolism. All the metabolic activities, like catabolism. What actually the catabolism is? Breakdown of the complex molecules into the simpler form. In this process, there is a liberation of energy. There is a liberation of energy. Now, what actually the anabolism is? Combination of all the simple molecules to form a complex molecule. Right? In the catabolism, if we take an example, we will break the starch into the simpler form, glucose. When it comes to the anabolism, combination of simple glucose molecules to form a starch in the plant and to form a glycogen in the living organisms. That is anabolism. And we'll take what is the metabolism, whether the metabolism is a defining character in the living organism or not. Let us make it now. Let's understand that metabolism involves all the chemical reactions that to be happened in the body, in the living organism's body. All the chemical reactions are considered metabolic reactions, whether it is a catabolic or an anabolic. Next, these chemical reactions we can do it outside the living organism cell. In the laboratory setup, we can do a lot of metabolic activities, but we are not doing that metabolic activities in the cell, in the living cell. Then we will consider that the metabolism is a defining characteristic of a living organism. That means all the biological chemical reactions will only happen in a living organism in a proper systematic way. However, we are doing in vitro in the lab setup, but it is not happening in the living cell. It is happening in the test tube. Right? Then we can consider that living organisms will perform metabolism. Okay? Then we have learnt about an introduction of the living organism in the living world, and we have understood the characteristics of living organisms like growth, reproduction and metabolism. Right? Next class we will learn about some more characteristics in a deep manner. Thank you for listening. Thank you.